Okay, good morning. Sorry for my rushed entrance. Not yet ice worthy this winter, so I had to drive slowly. My topic is Joseph Thomas Pardee, born 1871, died 1960, and I'm writing a book about him. And doing research on Pardee isn't as simple as Googling the name. When Joe Pardee was a little boy growing up in Philipsburg, there was another Joe Pardee in town who was a miner. When Joe Pardee lived in Missoula, a different Joe Pardee had just gone off of the city council. And Joe Pardee also lived in Stevensville, where an older Joe Pardee, who was a miner, had sold his homestead to Marcus Daly for the thoroughbred ranch. And when Joe Pardee was a miner in eastern Oregon, there was another Joe Pardee with a Pardee mine in the neighboring county. So there are lots of Pardees. Now some are related, but related in a sense that you don't know your relatives. For example, Governor George Pardee of California, governor during the Great Earthquake, and my subject, Joe Pardee, share the same great-great-great-grandfather. Now, I don't know about you, but in our family, we don't keep in touch with those cousins. And from as near as I can figure, Joe Pardee didn't keep in touch with the governor either. Although on one vacation in 1897 to San Francisco, this Joe Pardee did take a photograph of the George Pardee mansion in Oakland, because it's in his photo album from his vacation. But there's no indication in surviving records of the governor or of Joe Pardee that they ever corresponded or knew each other. Furthermore, most of the Pardees are not related. Pardee, from the French, Pardee. That's 16th century pronunciation. The way I learned it in high school French is pour Dieu, for God. The Pardees was not a family name. It was a name given by the English and Italians to French Protestant refugees in the 1500s who had lost their war with the Catholics. And they fled to England, and they fled to Italy, and as religious radicals do, they greeted each other with Pardee. And so as they were born in England, the first one born in England was given the name Pardee. So there's all sorts of unrelated Pardees as well as distantly related Pardees. I have Joe Pardee back to the 1500s, to the first one born in England, and the birth record does not give the parents' names, suggesting that perhaps the father didn't survive the war with the Catholics, and suggesting the mother may have died in childbirth, which was very common then. We don't know because there isn't evidence. But we do have that guy being born in England in the 1500s and one of his sons immigrating with the Pilgrims, those other religious refugees, religious radicals who were discriminated against and had to leave their homeland. So anyways, doing a biography can be challenging because you're not just looking at your subject. You're looking at all of the things that can mislead you on your subject. And you folks are welcome to speak up as we go along. You don't have to just sit there. You can speak up, or you can get up and get more cookies. Okay. Joseph Thomas Pardee, born in Salt Lake City. And tomorrow I'm giving a talk on his father as to why the son of an Ohio banker and a professional potter from Ohio was in Salt Lake City. But that's tomorrow's talk. Today is Joe. Born in Salt Lake City to James Knox Pardee and Marie Lukens Pardee. From the age of 3, though, he grew up in Philipsburg, Montana. This was his boyhood home that he grew up in. This, after he graduated from college, he opened an assay office. He didn't graduate from college, but I'll get to that in a minute. But after college, he opened an assay office in this building. And both buildings are still on Broadway in Philipsburg, Montana. This is now called the Hawk House because when Joe sold it in 1901, he installed a kitchen behind the office and turned it into a cottage that the Hawk family put the elderly woman in. And as elderly women sometimes do, she lived a long time, and to this day it's known as the Hawk Cottage because she lived there. And this is now the Young House, the Young Zone, the antique store downtown. But both are still there in Philipsburg, which surprised me when I went looking. That old wooden buildings had survived. But Philipsburg, most of the downtown is brick buildings, and so it didn't burn the way some pioneer towns did. As a geologist in the room already know, Pardee is most famous for naming and describing Glacial Lake Missoula in 1910. And the Glacial Lake, I think I lost my pointer, but you see where it says ice dam in red on the Idaho-Montana border. When the ice dam broke, which it did repeatedly, maybe 80 to 100 times, as at the end of the Ice Age, the Cordelia ice sheet advanced and retreated with different, it was gradually warming, but there were still cold periods in there, just like we're gradually warming, but we wouldn't know it today. The ice dam would reform and break, and the waters from Montana, all the brown, through scouring eastern Washington into Scablands, going down the Columbia, backing up the Kalama Narrows. There's a reason why the Port of Kalama is a major port on the Columbia, even though there's no place for a major town. Backed up here and went up the Willamette Valley, leaving erratics, boulders, that when the ice dam broke, there was ice along the shore that broke loose, but there were boulders that was attached to rocks in the mountains. That ice on the floodwaters carried the boulders almost as far as Eugene, Oregon. And the Willamette Winery District is defined by where the floodwaters were. So it's a very interesting story. And then as water went out to the Columbia, of course, this all drained. But that's what Pardee is most known for, is naming the lake, and in 1942, publishing the evidence that when the ice dam broke, there was catastrophic flooding. In the 1800s, when geologists were professionalizing, separating from natural philosophy, the study of all sciences, to a distinct discipline, geologists had rejected the biblical flood. And that meant they rejected all of this talk about big floods. And so there were different theories on what had flooded this, including Glacial Lake Spokane and Glacial Lake Columbia, including melting glaciers, but none of those had the catastrophic flooding effect that would have scoured eastern Washington into scablands. And Pardee in the 1920s already proposed that it was Glacier Lake Missoula that provided the water. And in 1942, he published the evidence that, yes, Glacier Lake Missoula catastrophically drained. Within 2 weeks, all of this flood water going up every valley in Montana, in western Montana, all drained out, providing a force to scour eastern Washington into scablands and back up the Willamette. And that evidence was on your way to hot springs. It has to be on your way to hot springs because there's nothing else out there. It's north of Plains. It's in the middle of nowhere, but there are the Camas Prairie ripples. You know how at the edge of a lake shore, the water coming in puts little ripples in the gravel? Well, there's 50-foot high ripples on the Camas Prairie.
Wow.
50-foot high ripples. Evidence that there was a massive draining of the lake. And so that's what Pardee is famous for. His father was a Civil War veteran, a potter in Ohio, turned smelter builder in Utah, turned mining expert in Montana. Silver mine, gold mine. His mother sitting on the porch, Joe on the horse, Alamo at the house that's still in Philipsburg, remodeled today, but the father was a mining expert. He supervised mines, he managed mines, he was president of mines. He dealt with the big investors out east in Philadelphia and St. Louis and New York. This is the inside of the home. The home looks kind of modest, but the newspapers touted it as a nice modern home when it was built in Philipsburg. And as you can see, the family was well-to-do. Always a piano in every home throughout Joe Pardee's life. He studied piano and voice in college. He performed for entertainments. This was before radio, before TV. Being able to play and sing was part of any party's entertainment. But he took it further by studying voice and piano in college, in addition to studying mining, chemistry. When their apple tree got 4 apples on it, it made the newspaper as evidence that farmers could move to Philipsburg, that it had a temperate climate. I loved that when I came across it. He went to the College of Montana in Deer Lodge, a very prestigious school. In 1887, it opened the only school of mines between Chicago and Seattle, with nationally known faculty. There it is. That's Joe Pardee. He labeled the photo senior class because it's the second year in the School of Mines, so of a 4-year program, but since he was in the first class, by the second year, they were the senior class. He was a big man on campus, active in ice skating and tennis and all the clubs. The Presbyterian Church ran the college at this time, but they ran it as a non-sectarian college. His first year, he was only 15 when he went to college. High schools had not yet become the norm. In 1900, only 1 in 10 Americans had any high school education. And when he went to college in 1886, he had the grade school education. His first year, he enrolled in the normals program, which was common for school teachers. It's the university program without the foreign language requirement, because it was thought that the teachers teaching grades 1 through 8 didn't need the foreign language. It was common for the ministers in town to provide the foreign language training for the few young people in town who might have college aspirations. But he was in the normal program, which suggested to me that he was getting his language qualifications. Despite being in a mining community with immigrants speaking many languages, his family had come over in colonial times and they spoke English. I haven't been able to confirm that, but the second year the School of Mines opened. He took 2 years at the School of Mines, which were 2 semesters of 5 months, plus summer assignments for the 2 months they had off. And he continued his music studies while taking the full prescribed set course. You didn't have electives then. You had a prescribed course. If you were in the School of Mines, everyone took the same courses every year, the assigned courses. On top of a full load, he took his instrument and voice courses. He then transferred to the University of California at Berkeley. A lot of people say that he was a college dropout because he didn't get a college degree. There was no national system for transferring credits. And since every student in every major took the exact same courses, and those courses might vary at different schools, he went to the University of California as a special student, non-degree seeking student, which most schools had that category for adult students. And he studied chemistry 1 year and mining 1 year. So he had 5 years of college education. He was not a college dropout. He came back to Philipsburg and opened an assay office. And here's a photo of the assay office, the Pardee house. Main Street, the Hope Mine, the first silver mill was up here. The mine was over here. The other mines where his father worked were up this canyon, the Algonquin in northwest and speckled trout. And then over off to the right is Granite Mountain, where his father was involved in the West Granite Mine and the East Granite Mine, not the McClure big rich granite mine. But it didn't really matter because in 1893, we went off of bimetallism, where the government bought any and all gold and silver presented to the mint at fixed prices, and thereafter they only bought all the gold. So the price of silver crashed, and then most of the mines closed. That was 1893. So what do the silver miners do? They're lode miners working in silver. There aren't lode gold mines around. They go back to placer mining. And young Joe, right out of college, goes placer mining with him. And he staked, he got claims on what was then Sapphire Gulch, but there's a Sapphire Gulch down here. So this, after Pardee, well, there it is. After Pardee sold his claims here, this Sapphire Gulch was renamed Cornish Gulch. This is Rock Creek. Off to the right, 15 miles, is Philipsburg. He had claims on Quartz Gulch, but he actively mined Basin Gulch. And this little bit here, when he mined, was part of Quartz Gulch, but after Pardee sold out in 1898, in the early 1900s, because the Arica Mining Company was here, that little lower bit became Arica Gulch. And Pardee was a successful miner. It's hydraulic mining, which he knew. He'd gone to school in California, which had removed whole mountains with hydraulic mining. And that's Pardee's mine. And an employee named Jackson is here with the hose, washing it out. Another view of hydraulic mining in that gulch. There were various claims going up the hill. The problem was if you had a claim up the hill, you had no access to water. And there's a problem down here. This is a seasonal gulch. So they had maybe 8 weeks of mining a year. But it was rich enough that it supported Joe in a nice style. And when he sold it for the equivalent of $500,000. So he did all right. This is what it looks like today. And as a geologist know, you always get permission to go on private property, and this is private property. But nicely, I was granted permission from the owner, and I was also granted permission from the Arica Mining Company's successor, still mining Arica Gulch, for sapphires now instead of gold, to go through, to access through their property, and they gave me a nice tour of theirs in exchange for learning about their neighboring properties. He sells that, and his father talks him into going to the gold rush in Oregon, the second gold rush in the Oregon Alps, which is a term for the Blue Mountains of northeastern Oregon. And they go out, Joe's got his, it was $60,000, but equivalent to $500,000 from selling, plus all the money he had made over the years. And Joe is the buyer on record of the Diadem, a 2-claim mine in the Greenhorn Mountains, about 25 miles out of Sumter, Oregon, which is about 25 miles out of Baker City, Oregon. So, in the mountains. And this is the discovery hole. I actually found it. The whole area has been cleaned up by the Forest Service. But I did find the discovery hole, which is shown here. It's on the Diadem claim. The Diadem Gold Mining Company combined the Diadem claim and the Brindle horse, and they later were mining the Brindle horse and put their mill on the Brindle horse, which is 50 yards downhill from here. But it was interesting to go out and see the scale of it. The two claims, and the discovery hole is about here, so not far from the Brindle horse. And here there's a drop-off. This is all on a mountainside down to the Snow Creek claim, a different mine. But it's a Brindle horse where the mine and mill were developed. The only buildings that survived the Forest Service going in and trying to clean up the forest by getting rid of the mine. There's some ruins where the mill were, big cement, broken up pieces too big to remove. But this was the only surviving building where they kept the explosives, the magazine building. The Diadem Gold Mining Company is interesting. Pardee's father got sick in 1901, and they weren't finding a major vein. They were getting ore, they were recovering some gold, but the investors wanted money. The Pardees got out in 1901. Thereafter, the mine is contracted to neighboring mines to run, and neighboring mills ran. The mill closed down. One of the investors was heavily, they recovered their money. Joe recovered his money. His father didn't have money because of the 1893 crash in silver. But Joe recovered his money by selling to Butte investors, one of whom was Lee Mantle. You may remember Lee Mantle once tried to displace Butte businessmen by claiming the grounds under their business, and that was called the Diadem claim. And it went to court and stuff, and the businessmen won. Well, Lee Mantle was an investor here. He sued the gold mining company for not paying enough dividends, and basically the remaining people didn't defend the suit. It was in Baker City courts. The records survived the flood of 4 years ago, so I found the court records. And Mantle got to mine, which once it went into court, they stopped contracting out to neighboring mines to operate it, and it was closed. And it stayed in the Mantle family until it reverted back to Forest Service. But Joe did okay, because he sold out early enough. And he bought the Catlin House on East Main Street in Missoula, considered a rather nice home at the time. Catlins being one of the prestigious pioneer families in Missoula. And Joe lived there 1901 to 1904. And this is the view from the end of the block today. That's Higgins Street, which is the end of East Front Street, the block that house is on. And you might notice there are some flood lines on Jumbo. If you're wondering how, before he's hired by the USGS, how a miner publishes a seminal paper on Glacial Lake Missoula, this is part of why. And in that 1910 paper, he walked across the river to the university property to take a picture of the flood lines. Stevensville, Montana is the township in which the 3 Mile Creek comes down from Mount Cleveland. And Pardee and Watson had a neighboring claim on Basin Gulch. Watson and Pardee jointly buy up a bunch of claims on 3 Mile Creek, 270 acres total. And his partner Watson is right here. Other workers out on the claim. It's a nether placer hydraulic mine. There's some of the hydraulic scars. This also is on private property. And it changed hands between my visits, but fortunately all the new owners graciously gave me full access. It's up on a ridge from the dirt road that follows 3 Mile Creek. So you can drive by and not even see this is here. Interestingly, there are some Chinese walls here. It's possible for a white man to build a Chinese wall, but it certainly wasn't common, suggesting that before Pardee or during Pardee's time, they employed at least one Chinaman. The Exclusion Acts from the early 1880s and stuff meant that Chinese disappeared from newspapers and stuff. Matter of fact, one who had lived in Philipsburg for 25 years staked a claim in Henderson Gulch and was murdered. And everyone knows who the murderer was, but of course they didn't arrest anyone. It was just a Chinaman who had no right to gold. And so I haven't been able to track down when the Chinese built the Chinese walls. But I do know that after Pardee and Watson sold, the corporation that bought it went broke because they were doing stock jobbing, financial funny business elsewhere, and they went broke. And moreover, they didn't have the money they claimed when they bought it, because above where the scars are, there are ground sluicing scars from that corporation. And doing ground sluicing as a form of prospecting after 1900 was a sign of poverty. And so the corporation that bought it didn't have much, and then the corporation that bought it from them never got the money to get it going again. So the Pardees were the last ones, Pardee and Watson were the last ones to actively mine here. The scholar, this is obviously LEDAR mapping from the state geology office. It's about a mile from here to here, and then there's a major scar with Chinese walls here also that might be related. And I did find here a state claim post laying down, rotting, but clearly a state claim post lying in the field. But again, it's up on the ridge from the creek and the road. And when Pardee and Watson sold it, they got a contract to go up the creek and build a dam 200 feet wide, 50 feet high, 200 feet wide, and they had it 25 feet high when an investor in Missoula sent down some workers and told, with the written instruction, for Pardee to hire his crew and fire his crew and hire these guys. Whereupon Pardee and Watson walked off the job. And half their crew went with them. And so the dam was never completed. But the idea was hydraulic mining takes water, again, it's a small creek, build a reservoir, and they'd be able to mine, and then they'd be able to sell the wastewater for irrigation to the ranchers downstream. But it never happened because Pardee, even as a young man, wouldn't put up with unethical behavior, which I found rather striking. Down here you see the scar from the mining operations. Now, these blue lines are the old Glacial Lake bed shorelines. Each time the dam broke and reformed, the lake, if it didn't go higher than it had been before, set a new line. And because it was a warming trend in history, you get lines going down as each subsequent lake that there's a record of was lower. If a subsequent lake was higher, it would wash out the other line and we wouldn't see it. And that's why they don't know how many times the dam formed and broke. But you can see he is in Glacier Lake, Missoula country while he's doing all of this mining. He sails in 1903, builds a home outside of Stevensville on 3 Mile Creek, a couple miles from where the mine was, and he marries Ruby Schoonover of Philipsburg, the daughter of the dairy man in Philipsburg. They have a big dairy 3 miles outside of Philipsburg. 15-year difference in her age was considered respectable. Joe is the tall one, the short one is Ruby's father, the father-in-law. They're fishing on Rock Creek. This is the home Joe built in 1904 so that he could get married. This is a 1905 photo with their daughter, Mary Pardee. He's out of mining, he's not building a dam and a reservoir. He takes a job as music director at a rare, very rare, accredited high school, a private high school run by the Southern Methodist Church, but also run as a non-sectarian school, the Stevensville Training School. And he teaches music. But the church decides not to support it, so after 1 year, Pardee turns to being a private music instructor, advertising in the paper lessons. But from his home, where the picture was with his wife and daughter, he looked south at Cowles Butte, and the tree lines on the buttes, it's named after sheep farmer ranchers. The tree lines are very straight because they're on the old lake bed. And Pardee drew this picture in 1908, 2 years before he becomes a USGS full-time employee, and before he becomes a part-time employee with the USGS. And here's the drawing as published in his 1910 paper. He does become a part-time employee with the USGS, assigned to work in the Sumter Quad, i.e. in the Blue Mountains of northeastern Oregon. His lake photo from 1910. Philipsburg, there it is just beyond where the lake came. But the mining on Rock Creek was within the lake area, and his mining, here's Cowles Butte, and so his mining here was also in the lake area. So by his decade of mining, he was very familiar with Glacier Lake, Missoula. But the U.S. Geological Survey sends him to work in Oregon in late 1908 and in 1909. And he and his wife buy this property in Gladstone, which now just runs right into Portland, South Portland. And his father in 1914 after his wife died and a few months later, his father goes out to the woodshed, which I think is this building, but maybe is this building, and shoots himself. Well, Joe and Ruby and the little girl are in the house. Sad tale, but they keep the property into the 20s. Another view of the Gladstone property. 1910, Joe becomes a GS, junior geologist. A rather mature age, and a job that at that time required a PhD. He doesn't have a college degree, so everyone said he was a college dropout hired by the USGS. Obviously, he was hired as a mineral resources expert. People forget he spent his career with the USGS as a mineral resources expert, studying mines in the Appalachians, in Florida, in Oregon, in Montana. Because we most know him for his glacial work. But glaciology was a highly competitive, nasty field at that time. And Joe just published his papers, 2 papers in it, and skipped all that competitiveness and did his mineral resource work. In 1910, he and Ruby and little Mary moved to Washington, D.C. The yellow one is yellow today. I don't know what color it was when they had it, because I've only seen old pictures of the back porch. But you notice the trolleys here. This is in Columbia Heights, so it wasn't in downtown DC, but they had a trolley so he could get to work. Another view for Montana country kids living in a row house must have been interesting. Inside the house, fancy radio, fireplace. Their daughter, Mary, grew up basically in DC. But summers, Joe was out in the field. Every summer, he took his wife and his daughter. So you have Joe in the sunglasses and his daughter. This is outside of Keller, Washington. This is outside of Spokane, 1912, with the Montana erratic, a rock from the Rocky Mountains outside of Spokane. And here again is Samuel Watson. I haven't found much on Samuel Watson other than he mined next to Pardee in Basin Gulch. He mined with Pardee on 3 Mile Creek, and here he is with Pardee, but he doesn't show up in census records or anything. So if anyone knows Samuel Watson miner, let me know. I'm looking for more information. This is Pardee's office in DC, and I'm probably going too slow. I've got 2 minutes before I go over, so
don't worry about it.
Pardee's office. I love all the rock samples. I love the starch collar. I don't think I could work in a starched collar, but they did, and a secretary, of course. But they regularly went back to Philipsburg almost every year, except the couple summers they spent in the Carolinas doing gold during the 1930s gold rush. This is 1916, and their daughter Mary is visiting with the Hawk children. And remember that the assay office building became the Hawk Cottage, the same family. Pardee did a lot of field work in Montana, many summers. Here he is at Pioneer. I didn't want to put in too many photos, but when he went to Pioneer to study the phosphates beds, it was already a ghost town, and he and his wife Ruby rode their horses up there, and she tended the horses while he did his geology. The manganese, he studied in Nevada and Utah and Washington and Montana. He's credited in some publications with discovering the Philipsburg manganese, which is shown here, but he obviously didn't discover it. All those silver mines were throwing away manganese as an unwanted byproduct. So he was the one who published it rather than discovered it. Their daughter graduates from Central High School in DC. She bounces around a few years. She wasn't too academically inclined, married on the spur of the moment, divorced on the spur of the moment, and then settles in as a journalist student at the University of Montana, Missoula, and for a decade works for the Great Falls Leader. Yeah, the paper that went out of business. The Tribune's still in business, but she was the society editor for the Great Falls paper. Here's Pardee on the right, 1930. He's supervising a cooperation between the USGS and the Oregon Department of Mines, surveying the Cascade Mountain mining districts. This photo's in Cottage Grove for the Bohemia Mining District. And interestingly, with this photo, I found a photo of Mendenhall, head of the USGS, in Cottage Grove. And I'm going, why did the head of the USGS go to Cottage Grove when this field team was there? I took the photos to Cottage Grove. Mendenhall's on the porch of a house in a rocking chair, reading, showed it around. No one knew where that house was. One woman recognized that the siding on the house came from her grandfather's mill, because that was the only mill that ever made that type of siding joints. So when was the mill operating? Which part of town was being built then? And oh, wait a minute, the doctor's house, they remodeled the porch into a patient room. And so where's that former doctor's house? I went there with the photos, and it was an enclosed porch. They opened the door, and here it was, right like the photo. And why was Mendenhall visiting the Pardee party in Cottage Grove? Because his cousin, Mr. Mendenhall, the jeweler, lived there. I love the human interest that goes into reality. People have always been people, And if you gotta pick some place to go, why not go where you've got relatives to visit? Pardee studied the earthquake of 1925 and 35, and because of his fame in Glacial Lake Missoula, people overlook the fact that he studied faults in Montana and the earthquakes from the 20s, from the 25 earthquake on, and in 50s too, after more than a decade after leaving the USGS, he publishes the first evidence that Montana is stretching, that the basin and range province type of geology is happening here. And you can see it up, if you go up the Boulder Valley, Boulder Batholith on the west side, the erosion dikes coming down the hillside. Some of them are separated into a hill and then the mountains, and now that separation is where the fault line is and where the crust has stretched. But he spent decades studying the faults and the earthquakes in Montana. Forced retirement at age 70. Thereafter, he spends a decade as a consultant working with reclamation on dam site locations, which is another thing he had done with the USGS, like the Hungry Horse Dam in Montana. He had done geology there on the appropriateness and stuff. But the forced retirement, in 54, he and his wife moved back to the ranch she grew up on in Philipsburg. She had inherited a half interest, and they still owned a half interest. And their daughter and her husband, her third husband, owned the other half interest. And Joe and Ruby lived with them for the rest of their days. But they liked to vacation up at Hot Springs, Montana. And this is at Symes Resort in Hot Springs, Montana. Pardee died in 1960. Ruby lived to 1976. Their daughter lived till 1994. She lost her third husband, Ralph, in 88 to dementia. And that's just a basic overview of what's going to be a book as I develop all these stories. Any questions or comments?
I mean,